The metal zipper on my canvas military duffel bag cut through the silence like a knife. I pulled it closed halfway, checked the side compartment one last time, and slid a weatherproof folder between two sets of field uniforms. The bag weighed just over 60 pounds. I'd carried heavier through flooded airfields and disaster zones. The weight didn't bother me, the room did. The foyer of the Sinclair estate was designed to impress people before they had a chance to think. 30-foot ceilings, imported marble, a chandelier that cost more than my first 2 vehicles combined. My mother loved telling guests that the staircase had been hand-carved by Italian craftsmen. What she never mentioned was that nobody in the family had climbed it honestly in years. Wind rattled the antique glass panels beside the front doors. Somewhere beyond the dark windows, waves were rolling against the Newport shoreline. The storm moving in from the Atlantic had already knocked out ferry service for the evening. Sterling Sinclair stood at the bottom of the staircase, holding a crystal glass of 18-year-old scotch. My father always looked most comfortable when he was judging someone. He took a slow sip and watched me pack. Then came the smile. Not a happy smile, a victorious one. Go and walk out, Audrey. His voice carried easily through the foyer. But we both know the truth. I adjusted the strap on my duffel bag. You'll never survive without me. I didn't answer. I didn't slam the bag. I didn't roll my eyes. Instead, I looked down at the carved wood inlay built into the floor and took a slow breath. The silence bothered him more than any argument could have. My father believed every conversation was a negotiation. Every disagreement was a contest. Every relationship came with a balance sheet. Silence gave him nothing to fight. That's it, he asked. No speech, no lecture about independence. I zipped another compartment. No. His eyebrows lifted. No speech. The wind shook the windows again. My father laughed softly and swirled the scotch. You always did mistake stubbornness for strength. 3 long steps above him, my mother stood frozen beside a bronze sculpture she had spent $12,480 on at a charity auction the previous spring. Eleanor Sinclair looked nervous. Not because of the argument, because arguments were normal. What worried her was the possibility that someone might hear one. Sterling, she said carefully. Maybe we should all calm down. We are calm. He didn't even look at her. My mother immediately fell silent. That was another family tradition. Across the hallway, my younger brother leaned against the doorway to the library. Mitchell Sinclair wore a navy sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. His watch flashed under the chandelier every time he moved his wrist. I recognized it. A Vacheron Constantin. The same watch he'd posted online 3 weeks earlier with the caption, "Hard work pays off." That had almost made me choke on my coffee. Mitchell hadn't worked a full month without quitting since he was 26. He smiled at me. She's bluffing. I'm not. Come on, Audrey, he laughed. Where are you even going? Back to one of your concrete bunkers? I looked at him. Actually, yes. His grin faded slightly. I enjoyed that. Not enough to smile. But enough. Mitchell had spent his entire adult life treating my career like a weird hobby. To him, success meant country clubs, investment accounts, and photos taken on the decks of borrowed yachts. To me, success meant landing a military cargo aircraft on a damaged runway at 2:17 in the morning and knowing everyone aboard would make it home safely. Different definitions. Different worlds. My father raised his glass again. You know what your problem is? I checked the buckle on my duffel. I have a feeling you're about to tell me. You don't understand how the real world works. That one almost made me laugh. Almost. I had spent the last 11 years evaluating military infrastructure after hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, and wildfires. I'd inspected bases where entire neighborhoods had disappeared. I'd worked 12-hour shifts wearing body armor in temperatures that reached 112 degrees. 3 months earlier, I had reviewed damage reports totaling $48.6 million after a coastal storm destroyed sections of an airfield. But apparently I didn't understand the real world. Interesting, my father continued. You think discipline solves everything. No. You think hard work solves everything. No. His face tightened. What exactly do you think, Audrey? I finally looked directly at him. I think eventually every structure tells the truth. The room became very quiet. My father frowned. Mitchell looked confused. That wasn't unusual. I picked up my duffel and set it beside the front door. The movement seemed to energize my father. There. He pointed at the bag. That's exactly what I'm talking about. What? That attitude, I waited. You always think you're smarter than everyone else. My mother shifted uncomfortably. Mitchell nodded immediately. Of course he did. My father took another sip. Without this family, you'd have nothing. The statement hung in the air. Outside, thunder rolled across the water. I looked at the man standing beneath the chandelier. The man who had spent years reminding me what everything supposedly cost: the tuition, the house, the opportunities, the sacrifices. Always the ledger, always the debt, never the relationship. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him, almost. Then I noticed the unopened overnight envelope sitting on the entry table. Federal Express, priority delivery. The sender information had been covered by a legal firm's label. My father followed my eyes and subtly moved in front of the envelope. Interesting. Very interesting. For the first time that evening, I wondered whether this confrontation had less to do with me leaving and more to do with something else entirely. Something he didn't want discussed. Something expensive. Something urgent. Mitchell noticed his movement too. A quick glance passed between them, just 1 second. But I caught it. Years of inspecting structures teaches you something valuable. Cracks always appear before collapse. You just have to know where to look. Before I could ask about the envelope, a pair of headlights swept across the front windows. A vehicle had entered the circular driveway. My father straightened instantly. His posture changed. His expression changed. Even his voice changed. The angry patriarch disappeared. The polished businessman returned. A smile spread across his face. This one was fake. Perfect timing, he said. Mitchell immediately adjusted his sweater. My mother smoothed her hair. I watched all three of them transform in less than 5 seconds. That told me everything I needed to know. Whoever had just arrived wasn't a guest. He was the reason I had been ordered home in the first place. And, judging by the nervous look my father failed to hide quickly enough, the storm outside wasn't the biggest problem approaching the Sinclair estate. Rain tapped steadily against the tall windows, while I watched my father prepare for the arrival of his important guest. The transformation was impressive. 30 seconds earlier, Sterling Sinclair had been lecturing me about survival. Now, he was straightening his jacket cuffs and checking his reflection in a glass cabinet like a politician preparing for a campaign speech. People often ask how controlling parents become controlling. In my experience, it rarely starts with shouting. It starts with accounting. My father measured everything: money, favor, approval, attention. To Sterling Sinclair, love wasn't something you gave freely. It was something you distributed strategically, like dividends. When I was growing up, I didn't understand that. At 10 years old, I thought every father kept mental records of every dollar spent on his children. At 14, I thought every family discussed expenses the way other families discussed sports. At 18, I finally realized something was wrong. Normal parents don't hand you an invoice disguised as affection. My father did. The first major fight happened when I was 22. I had just finished college and received an offer to join an Air Force civil engineering unit. The position wasn't glamorous. That's all starting salary certainly wasn't. Meanwhile, Sinclair Capital Management, my father's wealth management firm, had a climate-controlled corner office waiting for me. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Private parking, assistant included. Mitchell called it the easiest 6-figure job in Rhode Island. My father called it my future. I called it a prison sentence. The conversation lasted 43 minutes. I remember because I looked at the grandfather clock twice. My father explained everything I was throwing away: the salary, the family connections, the opportunities, the prestige. Then he made one mistake. He assumed money was the only thing people wanted. "What exactly do you think you'll accomplish in the Air Force?" he asked. I still remember my answer: something real. The room became very quiet. Not angry quiet, dangerous quiet. My father looked at me the way a banker looks at a bad investment. 3 days later, he cut me off completely. No financial support, no trust fund access, no family assistance, nothing. My mother cried. Mitchell laughed. My father gave me 12 months. His exact prediction was written in an email I still have somewhere. "You'll be back before next Christmas. You don't know how expensive life is. You'll never survive on your own." At the time, he genuinely believed he was right. Most people did. The funny thing about survival is that it becomes much easier once nobody is paying you to stay dependent. My first assignment took me to Louisiana after a hurricane damaged several military facilities. The hotel was so bad that one elevator worked only on odd-numbered floors. The coffee tasted like burned cardboard. The air conditioning sounded like a lawnmower trapped inside a washing machine. I loved every minute of it, because every decision mattered, every repair mattered, every improvement mattered. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared about my last name. Nobody cared how expensive my clothes were. They cared whether I could solve problems. That was refreshing. Over the next decade, I worked on projects in places most of my family's friends couldn't find on a map. Flood zones, storm recovery sites, remote installations, emergency airfields. I learned how quickly nature exposes weakness. A retaining wall doesn't care about social status. A damaged foundation doesn't care about family reputation. Physics is brutally fair. Structures either hold or they don't. Meanwhile, life at the Sinclair estate followed a different set of rules. Mitchell remained home. That part wasn't surprising. The surprising part was how expensive staying home became. Every Christmas visit revealed another upgrade, another vehicle, another renovation, another luxury purchase. At 27, Mitchell bought a European sports car. At 29, he joined 3 private clubs. At 31, he spent nearly $20,000 on a destination birthday party for himself. He posted photos of every single one. Success, according to Mitchell, required excellent lighting. My father financed almost all of it. At first, I assumed Sinclair Capital was simply performing well. Then I started noticing details, small details, the kind most people ignore. My father refinanced property he once claimed was debt-free. Investment accounts stopped being discussed openly. Staff turnover increased. Several longtime employees quietly disappeared. One family friend sold a vacation property unexpectedly after a business partnership with Sinclair Capital ended badly. None of it proved anything, but I evaluate structures for a living. Patterns matter. A single crack means very little. 10 cracks usually mean something else. The rain intensified outside. Across the foyer, Mitchell was still pretending not to be nervous. He kept checking his watch, then his phone, then his watch again. That alone told me more than any financial statement could. People who are comfortable don't check the time every 30 seconds. My father glanced toward the driveway, again and again and again. The man who once controlled every room he entered suddenly looked like someone waiting for exam results. Interesting. Very interesting. My mother finally broke the silence. "Audrey," she said softly, "maybe tonight isn't the best night for disagreements." I looked at her. For a moment, I felt something close to sadness. Not anger, not frustration, just sadness. Because my mother had spent 40 years trying to preserve a picture instead of a family. If nobody acknowledged the cracks, maybe the house wasn't falling apart. That seemed to be her strategy. Unfortunately, reality doesn't negotiate. Neither do foundations. Neither do debts. And neither do storms. A pair of headlights swept across the front windows again. This time the vehicle stopped. Nobody moved for a second. Then the engine shut off. My father immediately set down his glass. Mitchell straightened his shoulders. My mother forced a smile. I simply watched. The guest they had been waiting for had finally arrived. And, judging by the tension that suddenly filled the foyer, everyone in my family understood the same thing. Whatever happened next wasn't going to be decided by charm, family history, or expensive furniture. It was going to be decided by facts. The front door opened before anyone could say another word. A gust of damp ocean air swept into the foyer, carrying the smell of rain and salt water. A man in a dark overcoat stepped inside, calmly closing an umbrella before handing it to a waiting staff member. Mr. Wallace Gable looked exactly like someone trusted with approving or denying millions of dollars. Nothing flashy, nothing wasted. No oversized watch, no designer labels, no performance. Just a clean charcoal suit, polished shoes, and the kind of expression that suggested he spent most of his life listening to people exaggerate. My father practically glided across the foyer. "Mr. Gable." The smile returned instantly, warm, confident, manufactured. "Welcome to the Sinclair estate." Gable shook his hand. "Thank you for having me." His voice was calm and measured, the kind of voice that never needed to be loud. Mitchell appeared beside them almost immediately. The timing was impressive. Like he'd been rehearsing. Mitchell Sinclair. He extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you." Gable nodded politely. Then his eyes moved across the room. For a brief second, they landed on my military duffel bag. Then on me. Then back to my father. Interesting. Very little escaped attention. "Please," my father said. "Let us show you around." The performance had officially begun. I watched the entire thing unfold like an engineer watching someone paint over structural damage. It looked impressive from a distance. That was the point. My father led him through the foyer while casually mentioning the estate's history. The property had been in the Sinclair family for generations. The grounds covered nearly 12 acres. The waterfront views were considered some of the finest in Newport. Most of those statements were technically true. The problem was what he wasn't saying. Mitchell jumped in immediately. We recently invested heavily in upgrades. Of course he did. People who know they're lying usually add unnecessary details. We modernized several areas of the property. My father nodded. Significant improvements. I almost smiled. Neither of them could define significant if their lives depended on it. The only improvement I'd personally noticed during the last few visits was a wine refrigerator that cost $17,400. Apparently, preserving expensive bottles had become a higher priority than preserving financial stability. My mother followed alongside them, nervous, careful, always trying to keep the edges smooth. "Would you like some wine?" she asked. Gable smiled politely. "Maybe later." Good answer. The man was here to work. Meanwhile, I remained near the foyer. My duffel bag still sat beside the front door. Part of me considered leaving. It would certainly make everyone's evening easier. My father clearly wanted that. In fact, that had been the entire purpose of today's argument. He hadn't invited me home because he missed me. He hadn't suddenly developed interest in family reconciliation. He wanted me gone before Wallace Gable arrived. The realization wasn't painful anymore, just familiar. Years ago, it would have bothered me. Now it felt like reading old inspection reports. Expected findings, no surprises. As the group moved into the adjoining sitting room, Mitchell glanced back at me. Then he laughed. "Just let her go." "Dad," his voice carried easily through the doorway. "She doesn't understand high finance anyway." My father chuckled. My mother pretended not to hear it. Gable didn't react. "I noticed that too," Mitchell continued. "Audrey thinks every problem can be solved with a toolbox." I looked at him. "Sometimes," he grinned. "There you go." Then he turned toward Gable. "My sister's in the Air Force." The way he said it sounded almost charitable, like he was explaining an unfortunate condition. "She's always preferred practical things." Practical things. Interesting description. I wondered if he considered debt practical, or hiding financial problems, or financing luxury purchases with borrowed money. Those seemed very popular in this house. Gable finally spoke. "Air Force?" I nodded. "Civil engineering." Something changed in his expression, not dramatically, just enough. "What kind of work?" "Disaster recovery, infrastructure assessment, base construction." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That sounds important." Before I could answer, Mitchell stepped in. "She's being modest." No, he wasn't helping me. He was redirecting attention. A habit he'd developed years ago. Whenever someone started taking me seriously, Mitchell became uncomfortable. The spotlight was his oxygen supply. My father immediately joined him. "Audrey has always been independent." Translation: difficult, stubborn, uncooperative. The family dictionary had some unusual definitions. I watched Gable process everything quietly. No judgment, no assumptions, just observation. The same way I inspect structures. Collect information first. Draw conclusions later. I respected that. A few minutes passed. Conversation drifted toward property values, regional markets, insurance costs, coastal real estate. Topics Mitchell clearly believed made him sound sophisticated. Unfortunately, confidence and knowledge are not the same thing. "Waterfront property has never been stronger," he announced. Gable nodded. "Some areas are performing well." Mitchell missed the qualifier completely. That was also typical. My father guided the discussion expertly. Or at least he tried. Every topic somehow circled back to the estate, its value, its importance, its prestige. The house wasn't just property to him, it was identity, status, proof. Without it, much of what he believed about himself would disappear. The realization settled heavily in my mind. Because suddenly the urgency made sense, the argument, the pressure, the nervous energy, the overnight legal envelope, the desperate smiles. Something was wrong, very wrong. And whatever it was had reached the point where Wallace Gable's opinion could determine whether the Sinclair lifestyle survived another year. Thunder rolled across the coastline again. The windows vibrated softly. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my father clapped his hands together. "Let's continue the tour." Mitchell immediately stepped forward. "Wait until you see the upgrades." There it was again, upgrades, the favorite word of people trying to increase value. Gable followed politely. My parents followed behind him. I looked down at my duffel bag. then toward the front door, then back toward the group disappearing into the estate. I should have left. That was the sensible choice. Instead, I grabbed the handle of my duffel, moved it away from the door, and set it beside a hallway table. The decision surprised even me, but something about the evening felt unfinished. Too many cracks, too many nervous glances, too many rehearsed conversations. And if there was one thing I had learned after years of evaluating failing structures, it was this. The most dangerous collapse is usually the one everyone pretends isn't happening. So I stepped away from my bag and followed them deeper into the house. The sound of rain followed us through the house like a steady warning. Nobody wanted to acknowledge. I kept a few steps behind the group as we moved from room to room. My father walked beside Mr. Gable with the confidence of a man, trying very hard to look confident. Mitchell stayed close enough to join every conversation before it was finished. Neither of them realized they were talking too much. People who believe in their own story usually don't need to sell it. The tour began in the formal dining room. Imported chandelier, restored woodwork, custom furnishings. My father delivered each detail smoothly. This table was commissioned specifically for the room. Gable nodded and wrote something on his clipboard. Mitchell immediately added another detail. The restoration alone cost nearly $80,000. Gable nodded again. Another note. No reaction, no admiration, no surprise, just information. That seemed to frustrate Mitchell. The dining room led into the main gallery, overlooking the ocean. Lightning flashed beyond the windows. For a brief second, the waves became visible through the darkness. The storm had definitely strengthened. My father noticed Gable looking toward the shoreline. The property has weathered every major coastal storm for decades. A slight pause followed. Then Gable asked a simple question. Any recent structural concerns? The silence lasted maybe half a second, too short for most people to notice. Long enough for me, my father smiled. None. Mitchell jumped in immediately. Everything's been upgraded. There was that word again. Upgraded. I folded my arms and continued listening. The group moved deeper into the estate. Every room received the same treatment. Claims, numbers, confidence, performance. At one point, Mitchell spent almost 3 full minutes discussing imported stone flooring. At another point, he described landscaping improvements that sounded suspiciously expensive. The entire presentation reminded me of a contractor trying to distract an inspector from looking at the foundation. Focus on the paint. Avoid the support seams. Mr. Gable remained calm throughout all of it. The man barely changed expression. But his eyes never stopped moving. Ceiling windows, corners, floor transitions, door frames. He wasn't admiring the house, he was studying it. I appreciated that. Eventually we reached the western wing overlooking the water. The view was spectacular. Nobody could deny that. Large windows stretched from floor to ceiling. The Atlantic churned beyond them. Rain hammered against the glass. Mitchell spread his arms dramatically. This is one of the strongest sections of the estate. Of course it was. According to Mitchell, every section was the strongest section. Gable looked around slowly. Interesting, Marisol smiled. The entire foundation system since was reinforced. My eyes shifted toward him. There it was, the first real lie, not an exaggeration. Not a marketing phrase, a lie. I knew because I had personally reviewed the maintenance records years earlier. No foundation reinforcement project had ever happened. Not even close. The closest thing was a cosmetic masonry repair, completed for $14,860 after a contractor found surface deterioration near the southern retaining wall. Different issue entirely, different budget, different project. Mitchell continued anyway. We invested heavily in storm protection. Gable looked toward the windows. When was that completed? Another brief pause, tiny, almost invisible. Then Mitchell answered. About 3 years ago. Interesting, because now he had added a date. Liars always get comfortable right before they make mistakes. I watched Gable's pen hover above the clipboard, not writing, waiting. That caught my attention immediately. The hesitation lasted less than a second. But it was there. He wasn't accepting the answer, he was evaluating it. My father sensed it too. I could tell from the slight tightening in his jaw. So he stepped in. We've always prioritized maintenance, a safer statement. Harder to challenge. Mitchell nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. The rain struck the glass harder. Thunder rolled somewhere offshore. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Gable walked toward one of the window frames. His fingers lightly touched the trim. Not enough to inspect, just enough to observe. Again his pen hesitated. Again no comment. The tension in the room shifted, not openly, not dramatically, but noticeably. Mitchell didn't see it. My father definitely did. I did too. Because I've spent years sitting through inspections where contractors hoped nobody would notice problems. The silence is always the worst part. When an experienced evaluator stops talking, it usually means they're thinking. And thinking is dangerous for people selling illusions. The tour continued. Second floor, guest suites, office spaces, private lounge, wine storage. Every room received another sales pitch. Every room received another confident explanation. And throughout all of it, Gable continued taking notes. Occasionally, he asked questions. Mostly he listened. The more Mitchell talked, the less comfortable I became. Not because he was fooling anyone. Because he seemed genuinely convinced he was. That kind of confidence can become expensive. We eventually entered a corridor overlooking the eastern side of the property. Large stoves faced the ocean. Another flash of lightning illuminated the coastline. For an instant, I noticed something near the edge of the grounds, a slight shift in elevation. Subtle, easy to miss, but familiar, very familiar. My attention moved toward the retaining structures near the shoreline. Interesting, very interesting. I said nothing. Not yet. Meanwhile, Mitchell was still talking. The property is probably in the strongest condition it's ever been. This time I noticed Gable's pen stop completely. Not moving, not writing, just resting against the clipboard. The expression on his face didn't change, but his eyes did. The skepticism was becoming harder to hide. And for the first time that evening, I realized something important. Mr. Wallace Gable wasn't being impressed. He was collecting contradictions. One by one, quietly, patiently. The same way engineers collect evidence before writing a report nobody wants to read. My father continued smiling. Mitchell continued boasting. The storm outside continued building. And somewhere between the lies being told and the notes being written, reality had finally entered the Sinclair estate. A flash of lightning illuminated the shoreline, just as the groups stepped into the sunroom. The space had always been my mother's favorite part of the estate. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the room. The Atlantic stretched beyond them, dark and restless under the storm clouds. Waves crashed against the coastline below, sending white spray into the air. The room was beautiful. That didn't mean it was sound. Mr. Gable slowly approached the windows. My father followed close behind. Mitchell practically raced ahead. This room alone adds tremendous value to the property. Gable nodded politely. It certainly offers an impressive view. Mitchell smiled. He took that as encouragement. Mistake. Most experienced evaluators learn how to sound interested without agreeing to anything. The coastal protection system is one of the estate's strongest assets, Mitchell continued. I immediately looked toward the shoreline. Here we go. The retaining wall is solid granite. His confidence never wavered, built to withstand hurricane conditions. Silence followed. The rain hammered the glass, the ocean surged below, and for the first time all evening, Wallace Gable didn't immediately write anything down. Instead, he studied the shoreline, then the windows, then the ceiling, then the shoreline again. Interesting. Very interesting, Mitchell kept talking. The previous owners invested heavily in reinforcement. Another lie. The structure should easily last decades. Gable didn't answer. His pen remained motionless. That was the moment I decided to speak. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone. Not because I wanted revenge. Mostly because I was tired. Tired of listening to people explain engineering concepts they didn't understand. 12 years. The room became still. Everyone turned toward me. Mitchell frowned. What? I stepped closer to the windows. The retaining wall has maybe 12 years left. My father closed his eyes briefly. Not dramatically, just enough. The reaction told me everything. He already knew there was a problem. Mitchell laughed. A short, irritated laugh. Here we go. I ignored him. Mr. Gable looked interested for the first time all evening. You're confident about that estimate? Reasonably, I pointed toward the shoreline. Oh, the wall isn't granite. Mitchell immediately shook his head. Yes, it is. No, it absolutely is. I looked at him. No, Mitchell, it isn't. The room became very quiet. My mother shifted uncomfortably near the doorway. My father stared at me with the expression of a man watching a controlled burn approach a fuel tank. Gable remained silent, waiting, listening. I appreciated that. The visible facing stone was designed to resemble granite, I explained, but the structural material underneath is limestone. Mitchell crossed his arms. You can't possibly know that. Actually, I could. very easily. The repair records from Coastal Heritage Restoration in 2018 referenced limestone stabilization. His face immediately changed. Not much, just enough. Interesting. Apparently, I was the only person who remembered paperwork. I continued. Limestone performs differently in coastal environments. Gable nodded slightly, still listening, still saying nothing. The salt exposure accelerates deterioration. I walked toward the eastern corner of the room, the same corner I'd been watching since we arrived. See that section? Everyone followed my gaze. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. That was the problem. Most failures don't announce themselves, they whisper. I pointed toward a section of drywall near the floor. Hairline fracture. Mitchell squinted. I don't see anything. Exactly. What does that mean? It means you're not trained to identify structural movement. His face turned red instantly. That wasn't my goal. Just physics. I crouched slightly. The crack measured less than 1/8 of an inch. Small, but meaningful. The settlement pattern is consistent with shoreline support degradation. Gable finally wrote something. The scratching sound sub of his pen seemed unusually loud. I stood again, then pointed upward. Look at the ceiling transition. Another pause. My father's expression grew darker. Gable stepped closer. The uneven alignment was subtle, very subtle. But once you saw it, you couldn't ignore it. The load distribution is shifting. Mitchell looked completely lost. My mother looked worried. Gable looked fascinated. I continued. There's another issue. Mitchell groaned. Of course he did. I walked toward an exposed decorative beam running along the edge of the room. The wood had been stained beautifully, expensively, cosmetically. I touched a small section near the support connection. The salt exposure is causing rot. Mitchell immediately objected. That's impossible. I rubbed a thumb lightly across the area. Fine material came loose. Not much. Enough. Salt rot. Gable stepped forward, his attention sharpened instantly. I recognized that look. Professional curiosity, the kind that appears when someone finally encounters expertise instead of marketing. How extensive? He asked. Impossible to determine visually. That answer seemed to surprise him. Good. Real professionals don't pretend certainty. You'd need invasive testing. I paused. Probably several locations. Gable nodded slowly, then looked back toward the windows, then the wall, then the ceiling. The pieces were connecting. Mitchell wasn't happy. His face had turned an impressive shade of red. The expensive watch suddenly seemed less important. You always do this, he snapped. I looked at him. Do what? Act like you're the smartest person in the room. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable. When facts become uncomfortable, some people attack the messenger, much easier than arguing with structural deterioration. I didn't insult anyone. You're undermining us. No. I shook my head calmly. I'm describing the building. Big difference. Mr. Gable looked directly at me. The expression in his eyes had changed completely. The polite interest from earlier was gone. In its place was professional respect. Not for me personally, for competence, for evidence, for reality. Engineers recognize that look immediately, because we rarely receive it from people like Mitchell. My father finally spoke. His voice was controlled, too controlled. Audrey. I turned toward him. That's enough. The smile he'd been wearing all evening was gone, completely gone. For the first time since Wallace Gable arrived, Sterling Sinclair looked worried. Not annoyed, not embarrassed. Worried. Because the performance was beginning to fail. Not due to insults. Not due to family drama. Not due to emotion. The problem was much simpler. I had introduced physics into a room built entirely on storytelling. And physics doesn't care who owns the house. The moment Mr. Gable lowered his clipboard, my father made a decision. Not a good one. A desperate one. Excuse us for a moment. His smile returned so quickly it almost looked painful. The words were directed at Gable. The grip that followed was directed at me. My father's hand clamped around my elbow. Hard. Harder than necessary. Hard enough to make his intentions clear. He wasn't guiding me. He was removing a problem. Before I could respond, he pulled me into the hallway adjacent to the sunroom. The moment we cleared the doorway, the performance ended. The smile vanished. The polished businessman disappeared. The charming host evaporated. What remained was Sterling Sinclair, the real one, the one most people never saw. Mitchell followed immediately, shutting the hallway door behind him. My mother stayed in the sunroom. I wasn't surprised. Confrontation had never been her favorite activity. Silence was. The hallway felt smaller than I remembered. Rain rattled the windows, thunder rolled somewhere over the ocean. My father released my arm and turned toward me. His face was trembling, not from fear, from rage, raw rage. The kind he usually hid behind expensive suits and polite conversation. How dare you? The words came out as a hiss, not loud, much worse, controlled. How dare you? I said nothing. That only made him angrier. You come into my house. There it was, my house, his favorite phrase. The phrase that explained almost everything about him. Ownership, control, power. Those were his love languages. The house that provides for this family. He pointed toward the sunroom. The house that built everything you have. Interesting. Because the Air Force built most of what I had. My education afterward, my retirement account, my savings, my career, my certifications, my reputation. But facts rarely survived inside my father's version of reality. You walk in here and try to ruin me? I looked at him calmly. I answered a question. His jaw tightened. You embarrassed me. No, I shook my head. The building embarrassed you. Mitchell groaned. Unbelievable. I ignored him. My father took a step closer. For a second, I thought he might actually lose control. Not physically, emotionally. The difference matters. People like Sterling don't fear being wrong. They fear being exposed. You've always done this. The accusation surprised me, not because it was new, because it was old, very old. What exactly have I always done? Act superior. Mitchell immediately nodded. There it is. I looked from one to the other, the united front, the same one they'd been using for years. Whenever facts became uncomfortable, they changed the subject to my personality. Much easier. You don't have to argue with evidence if you can attack the person presenting it. You think you're better than everyone. I almost laughed. Almost. The irony was extraordinary. I wasn't the one who measured human value by income. I wasn't the one ranking family members based on obedience. I wasn't the one using money as leverage. But somehow I was the arrogant one. Interesting system. My father pointed toward the foyer. Look at you. I waited. That bag. Another gesture. Those military clothes. Another gesture. That attitude. He looked genuinely disgusted, as though I had personally offended him by becoming exactly what I said, I would become. Then came the sentence that finally explained everything. You are nothing but an ungrateful burden. The words folded his arms. Satisfied, my father stared directly at me, waiting, expecting, hoping. For what? Tears? Anger? Defensiveness? Something. Anything. The strange thing was that 10 years earlier, those words might have worked. At 22, they probably would have. At 25, they would have hurt. At 35, they felt different, not harmless, just revealing. Because people eventually tell you who they are. You simply have to listen. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 5 years earlier, I had spent 3 weeks helping assess storm damage at a military installation along the Gulf Coast. One building looked perfectly intact from the outside. Fresh paint, new signage, clean landscaping, beautiful. Then we inspected the interior. Corrosion everywhere, support members compromised, critical load points weakened. The structure wasn't failing because of one storm. It had been failing for years. Nobody wanted to pay attention. My father suddenly reminded me of that building. Impressive exterior, terrible maintenance. You should leave. His voice was calmer now, colder, more dangerous. Right now, I remained silent. He took another step forward. Get off my property before I have you removed. There it was. The final threat, the ultimate weapon, ownership, control, exile. For most of my life, he believed those things gave him power. Mitchell certainly believed it. His expression practically glowed with confidence. They thought they were winning. That was the remarkable part. Even now, even after everything, even after watching Wallace Gable question their claims, even after seeing the performance crack, they still believed the room belonged to them. I looked at my father carefully, really looked at him, not the suit, not the title, not the image, the man. And for the first time that evening, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, not satisfaction. Pity, quiet, genuine pity. Because I suddenly understood something he didn't. My father thought he was standing on solid ground. He wasn't. He thought he was protecting power. He was protecting an illusion. He thought he was throwing me out. That part almost hurt to watch. The hallway fell silent. Rain continued striking the windows. Mitchell waited impatiently. My father stared at me. The expectation was obvious. Break Audrey. Argue. Cry. Defend yourself. Do something. Instead, I simply looked at him. And the calmer I became, the more unsettled he appeared. Because for the first time all evening, I wasn't looking at a powerful man. I was looking at someone who had no idea what was about to happen next. The silence stretched long enough for my father to become uncomfortable. That was unusual. Sterling Sinclair had spent most of his life making other people uncomfortable. Not the other way around. The rain hammered the windows behind us. Thunder rolled over the coastline again, shaking the glass somewhere deeper in the house. Mitchell shifted his weight impatiently. Well, my father folded his arms. Are you leaving or not? I looked at both of them, then I turned and walked away. Mitchell laughed immediately. There we go. My father smiled, not a rueful smile, a relieved one. He thought the argument was over. He thought I had finally accepted defeat. The problem was that neither of them understood where I was walking. I crossed the foyer without saying a word. My military duffel bag still sat beside the hallway table exactly where I had left it. The same bag my father had mocked. The same bag Mitchell had treated like evidence of failure. I knelt beside it and unzipped a side compartment. The metallic sound echoed softly through the quiet house. Neither man moved. I reached inside, then pulled out a plain blue folder. Nothing fancy, no gold lettering, no expensive binder. Just a worn blue folder with slightly bent corners, the kind of folder nobody notices until it changes their life. When I stood, the laughter was gone. Mitchell frowned. My father looked confused. Good. I walked back toward them at an ordinary pace. No dramatic pause, no speech, no performance. I'd already seen enough performances for one evening. When I reached my father, I held out the folder. What's this? Open it. His expression darkened. I'm not interested in your games. It's not a game. For the first time all evening, I raised my voice just enough for every word to carry clearly, including into the sunroom, including toward the people standing beyond the hallway. I'm not ruining your loan, Dad. The sentence landed harder than I expected. The hallway became completely still. My father stared at me. Mitchell looked confused. I continued. The bank is going to deny it because you can't borrow against a house you don't own. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. For a moment, even the storm seemed quieter. Then my father laughed, a short laugh, an uncertain laugh. The kind people produce when their brain rejects information before processing it. What are you talking about? I nodded toward the folder. Open it. His hands remained motionless. Interesting. Part of him already knew, not the details, just the danger. Mitchell grabbed the folder first. Jesus Christ. He rolled his eyes. Now we're doing paperwork? He opened it carelessly. 3 seconds later, the color drained from his face. The change was immediate, visible, absolute. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. No words came out. That got my father's attention. What is it? Mitchell looked down at the documents, then back at me, then back at the documents. No, just one word. Quiet. Broken. No, my father snatched the folder from his hands. The hallway door opened behind us, mister. Gable stepped out from the sunroom, not because he was being nosy, because everyone had heard me. The hallway wasn't exactly built for privacy. My mother appeared behind him, concerned, nervous, confused. Nobody spoke. My father began reading. The first page was enough. His eyes stopped moving. The second page made his hand shake. The third page finished the job. I watched the realization arise slowly, painfully, like a crack spreading through glass. No. This time the word came from him, not Mitchell, no. His eyes rushed back across the paperwork, searching, looking for mistakes, looking for loopholes, looking for anything. There was nothing to find, because the documents were real, recorded, verified, legal, final. Wallace Gable stepped closer. He didn't touch the papers. He simply looked over my father's shoulder. Then he nodded once. Slowly, that single nod somehow carried more weight than an entire speech. The documents spoke for themselves. Owner of record, Audrey Sinclair. Not Sinclair Holdings. Not a family trust. Not an investment company. Me. 6 years earlier, my father had made a series of decisions he never thought anyone would discover. Risky borrowing, additional leverage, hidden debt, and eventually, a default. The mortgage wasn't public knowledge. He had worked very hard to keep it that way. Most of the family never knew it existed. My mother certainly didn't. Mitchell definitely didn't. I found out accidentally. A legal notice had arrived while I was home on leave. Wrong place, wrong time, or maybe exactly the right time. I spent 3 weeks investigating afterward. 3 very unpleasant weeks. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The estate was about to disappear. Public foreclosure would have destroyed the Sinclair name overnight. My father wasn't worried about losing the property. He was worried about people finding out. That distinction mattered, a lot. So I made a decision. Not because he deserved it, not because we were close, because, despite everything, it was still my family. I liquidated investments, sold assets, emptied savings accounts, used hazard pay accumulated from overseas assignments, pulled together every dollar I could legally access. The final amount came to $1,840,007, every cent I had. The purchase happened through a blind trust, no publicity, no announcement, no celebration, just paperwork. Months later, ownership transferred quietly. The foreclosure disappeared. The family name survived, and nobody ever knew until now. My father stared at the deed. His breathing had become noticeably uneven. Mitchell looked like someone trying to solve a math problem in a foreign language. My mother pressed a hand against her mouth. "Audrey," she barely whispered it. I looked at my father. The man who had spent years reminding me I couldn't survive without him. The man who had just threatened to throw me off his property. The irony was almost unfair. Almost. His eyes finally lifted from the paperwork. For the first time in my life, Sterling Sinclair looked genuinely afraid. Not of me, of reality. Because 6 years ago, without ever telling him, without asking for credit, without demanding gratitude, I had become something none of them imagined. Not the burden, not the outcast, not the dependent daughter. I had been their landlord the entire time. The deed slipped from my father's fingers and landed on the hardwood floor. Nobody moved to pick it up. The sound itself wasn't loud, but in that hallway it felt enormous. Sterling Sinclair stared at the document as if it belonged to someone else. For years, I had watched my father walk into rooms believing he controlled everything inside them. Employees, clients, friends, family. Tonight, that confidence was gone, completely gone. The smug smile that greeted me in the foyer felt like something from another lifetime. What stood in front of me now wasn't a powerful man, it was a frightened one. Mitchell looked even worse. He took 2 steps backward and bumped into the wall. His eyes kept moving between me and the paperwork on the floor, back and forth, trying to force reality into a shape he could understand. It wasn't working. I understood why. Mitchell had built his entire adult life around a simple assumption. Dad will take care of it. The car payments, the credit cards, the memberships, the vacations, the mistakes. Every time life handed him consequences, someone else absorbed the impact, usually my father, and now he was suddenly realizing something. For 6 years, my father hadn't been the safety net. I had. The realization hit him hard enough that he actually sat down on a hallway bench without saying a word. That may not sound remarkable, trust me. For Mitchell Sinclair, silence was a medical emergency. My mother was the first person to speak. "Audrey," her voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her. There were 100 possible answers, maybe more. Because none of them would have listened. Because I didn't want gratitude. Because somebody needed to solve the problem. Because public foreclosure would have destroyed the family. Because I thought protecting people was the right thing to do. In the end, I chose the simplest answer. It wasn't about telling anyone. My mother lowered her eyes. Deep down, I think she understood. Mr. Gable remained near the doorway, quiet, professional, observing, the same way he had all evening. The difference now was that nobody was performing anymore. Reality had ended the show. My father finally bent down and picked up the deed. His hands were shaking. I had never seen that before, not once. Not even during financial crises, not even during funerals, not even during emergencies. For the first time in his life, Sterling Sinclair had encountered a situation he couldn't control, and he hated it. "Audrey." His voice sounded smaller, almost fragile. The transformation was startling. I didn't know. There it was, the beginning. Not accountability, not an apology. The opening move, the attempt to rewrite history. I was under a lot of pressure, of course. Pressure, the universal excuse. I was trying to protect the family. Interesting. Because 6 years ago, protecting the family was exactly what I had done. The difference was that nobody knew about it. My father took a step toward me. A lot happened back then. Then another. And maybe I wasn't always, he searched for the word, kind, fair, honest, responsible. He settled on something safer. Perfect. Mitchell nodded immediately, as if that solved everything. I raised my hand. The movement wasn't aggressive, just firm. My father stopped talking, for once. The silence lasted several seconds. Rain continued striking the windows. Thunder rolled over the ocean. The storm was still there. It simply wasn't the biggest thing happening anymore. I looked directly at my father, then at Mitchell, then at my mother. For the first time all evening, nobody interrupted me. Survival isn't about controlling people with money, Dad. My voice remained calm. No anger, no revenge, no victory lap. Just truth. It's about holding the foundation steady when the storm hits. Nobody spoke, I continued. That's the difference between support and control. My father lowered his eyes. Mitchell stared at the floor. The words weren't complicated, but they landed. Because everybody in that hallway knew exactly what I meant. For years, my father had confused ownership with strength. He thought paying for things made him indispensable. He thought dependence created loyalty. He thought fear created respect. Meanwhile, the person he called a burden had quietly carried the entire structure when it started collapsing. Not because she was forced to, because she chose to. That distinction mattered. A lot. Mr. Gable finally closed his clipboard. The sound echoed softly through the hallway. I believe my assessment is complete. Nobody answered. There wasn't much left to say. The numbers would say what they needed to say. Facts usually do. I looked at my father one final time. Then at Mitchell. Neither of them looked angry anymore. Just stunned. Like people waking up in a house they thought they knew. Part of me expected satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead, I felt something lighter, relief. The exhausting work of carrying a secret was finally over. And unlike revenge, relief doesn't leave a mess behind. My father swallowed hard. What happens now? A fair question. I considered it for a moment. Then I smiled slightly, the first genuine smile I'd had all evening. Now, I reached for my duffel bag. The familiar weight settled comfortably into my hand. Now you deal with reality. His face fell. Not because I threatened him, because I didn't. That was the part he wasn't expecting. I wasn't selling his estate. I wasn't throwing anyone out. I wasn't humiliating him in front of Newport society. I wasn't interested in punishment. Real strength doesn't need petty revenge. The illusion was already gone. That was enough. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder and walked toward the front door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody knew how. The foyer looked different now. Not because the house had changed. Because the truth was finally visible. I opened the door. Cold rain-filled air rushed inside. The storm was still moving across the coastline. Powerful. Unpredictable. Real. I stepped outside and felt the rain against my face. Behind me stood a family, forced to confront reality for the first time in years. Ahead of me stood everything else. My career, my future, my freedom. I walked down the front steps without looking back. Because the strongest foundations aren't built from money. They're built from character. And for 6 years, whether anyone realized it or not, that was the only thing holding the Sinclair estate together. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm as I drove away from Newport. For a long time, I just listened to the rain. No phone calls, no messages, no dramatic confrontations. Just the sound of tires rolling across wet pavement and the strange feeling that something heavy had finally been removed from my shoulders. What surprised me most wasn't what happened inside the Sinclair estate. What surprised me was how little satisfaction I felt afterward. People hear a story like mine and assume the ending must feel amazing. The daughter proves everyone wrong. The arrogant father gets exposed. The spoiled brother gets humbled. The truth finally wins. And yes, there was a certain amount of relief. But relief and victory are not the same thing. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't replaying the moment my father's face changed when he saw the deed. I wasn't enjoying Mitchell's shock. Honestly, the thing I kept thinking about was much simpler. My father truly believed what he said. When he looked at me and declared that I would never survive without him, he wasn't trying to be cruel. He believed it. That's what stayed with me. For most of his life, Sterling Sinclair measured love the same way he measured investments. If he paid for something, he owned influence over it. If he financed something, he deserved loyalty in return. If he provided support, he expected obedience. Some people grow up thinking love is given. Others grow up thinking love is earned. My father treated love like a contract. And that's a dangerous way to build relationships. Because eventually people stop feeling loved. They start feeling managed. Looking back, I realized something important. The financial support was never the problem. Parents helping their children isn't wrong. Spouses helping each other isn't wrong. Friends supporting each other isn't wrong. The problem starts when help comes with invisible strings attached. The problem starts when assistance becomes leverage. The problem starts when every favor creates a debt that can never actually be repaid. A lot of people watching this story may recognize that feeling. Maybe it wasn't a parent. Maybe it was a partner. Maybe it was a relative. Maybe it was even a boss. Someone who constantly reminded you of everything they had done for you. Someone who kept score. Someone who made sure you never forgot who was supposedly responsible for your success. At first, that can look like generosity. Eventually, it starts feeling like ownership. I learned that lesson the hard way. When I left home at 22, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I simply wanted a life that belonged to me. The funny thing is that my father wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. Life was expensive. Very expensive. My first apartment wasn't impressive. The refrigerator made strange noises. The water heater failed twice. The parking lot flooded every time heavy rain rolled through. There were months when I checked my bank account more often than I checked my email. There were assignments that left me exhausted. There were mistakes. There were setbacks. There were moments when things would have been easier if I had simply accepted the comfortable life waiting for me back home. But easy and meaningful are rarely the same thing. Every challenge taught me something. Every problem I solved became confidence I earned myself. Every obstacle I handled without someone's permission made me stronger. That kind of confidence can't be inherited. It can't be purchased. It can't be gifted. You build it. One decision at a time, one responsibility at a time, one difficult day at a time. That's why I never crawled back, not because life was easy, because I finally understood what survival actually meant. Survival isn't having someone rescue you whenever things get hard. Survival is becoming the kind of person who can handle hard things. There's a huge difference. One creates dependence. The other creates strength. And here's something I've learned from years of working in disaster zones. People often underestimate themselves. I've watched communities rebuild after hurricanes. I've seen teams restore damaged airfields under impossible conditions. I've watched people adapt to circumstances they once thought would destroy them. Human beings are far more capable than they realize. The problem is that some people never get the chance to discover that capability because someone else is always stepping in to control the outcome. That was Mitchell's problem. My father spent years protecting him from consequences. He thought he was helping. In reality, he was preventing growth. Responsibility works like a muscle. If someone carries the weight for you forever, eventually you lose the ability to carry it yourself. That's true financially. It's true emotionally. And it's true professionally. The biggest lesson I took from everything that happened isn't about money. It isn't about property. And it certainly isn't about revenge. The biggest lesson is this. If someone constantly tells you that you cannot survive without them, pay attention. Not because they're necessarily evil, not because they're always wrong, but because truly supportive people don't spend their lives reminding you how powerless you are. They help you become stronger. They help you become more capable. They want you to succeed even when they aren't standing beside you. Control says, you need me. Love says, you've got this. Those two things sound similar when you're young, trust me. They are very different, and if my story helps even one person recognize that difference a little sooner than I did, then everything that happened inside that house was worth it. Because real independence doesn't begin when you have enough money. It begins when you stop letting other people decide what you're worth. A few weeks after leaving Newport, I found myself standing beneath a damaged aircraft hangar on a military installation along the Gulf Coast. The structure had survived a tropical storm, technically. From a distance, it looked fine. The roof was still attached. The walls were still standing. The building hadn't collapsed. Most people would have walked past it without a second thought. I couldn't, because experience teaches you something important. Structures don't fail the day they collapse. They fail long before that. Collapse is just the moment everyone finally notices. That hangar reminded me of my family, not because it was damaged, because the damage had been ignored. One of the most dangerous habits people develop is convincing themselves that a problem isn't serious because it hasn't exploded yet. I've seen it everywhere, in construction, in finance, in relationships, in families. The process is almost always the same. A small crack appears. Nobody wants to deal with it. Then another one appears, still manageable, still ignorable. Eventually, the damage becomes expensive, then painful, then impossible to hide. And suddenly, everyone acts surprised. They shouldn't be. The warning signs were there all along. My father wasn't ruined by one bad financial decision. He was ruined by years of refusing to acknowledge reality. The hidden mortgage wasn't the problem. It was the result of the problem. The real issue started much earlier. Every time appearances became more important than truth, every time image became more important than stability, every time pride became more important than responsibility, those decisions add up. People often ask how intelligent individuals end up in obvious trouble. The answer is simple. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to destroy their future. It happens gradually, one rationalization at a time, one shortcut at a time, one ignored warning sign at a time. Mitchell was another example. I don't hate my brother. Despite everything, I never did. But I spent years watching him confuse comfort with success. That's a mistake a lot of people make. Driving an expensive car doesn't automatically mean you're financially healthy. Living in a beautiful house doesn't automatically mean you're stable. Posting vacation photos doesn't automatically mean you're happy. Social media has made this problem even worse. People become experts at advertising the parts of life they want others to see. The rest stays hidden. Debt stays hidden. Stress stays hidden. Fear stays hidden. Reality stays hidden. Mitchell became very good at maintaining appearances. Unfortunately, appearances don't pay bills. Responsibility does. And every time my father rescued him from consequences, the lesson became harder to learn. One of the hardest truths I've learned is that protecting people from every consequence often creates bigger problems later. That applies to parents, managers, spouses, friends, anyone. Helping someone is good. Preventing them from growing is not. There's a difference. My mother taught me another lesson, not intentionally, but powerfully. Eleanor Sinclair spent decades trying to keep the family picture intact. Whenever conflict appeared, she smoothed it over. Whenever tension surfaced, she changed the subject. Whenever problems emerged, she focused on maintaining peace. That sounds noble. Sometimes it is. But sometimes peace is just avoidance wearing a nicer outfit. That distinction matters. A lot. Because unresolved problems don't disappear. They simply wait. The uncomfortable conversation you avoid today often becomes the crisis you face tomorrow. I've seen that pattern repeatedly throughout my career. A base ignores drainage issues. 2 years later, they're rebuilding roads. A facility postpones maintenance. 5 years later, they're replacing entire systems. The bill always arrives eventually. Reality is very patient. One reason I wanted to share this story is because I suspect many people watching are dealing with their own version of hidden cracks right now. Maybe it's financial. Maybe you've been avoiding looking at your bank statements because you're afraid of what you'll find. Maybe it's relational. Maybe there's someone you need to have an honest conversation with. Maybe it's professional. Maybe you know you're stuck in a situation that isn't sustainable. Maybe it's personal. Maybe you've been telling yourself you'll deal with something later. I understand. Nobody enjoys uncomfortable truths, but delaying reality doesn't reduce its cost. Usually, it increases it. One of the most valuable habits I've developed as an engineer is learning to inspect problems early, not because it's enjoyable, because it's cheaper. Emotionally, financially, practically. Everything becomes harder when ignored. Everything becomes more manageable when addressed honestly. The Sinclair estate didn't reach that breaking point overnight. The warning signs existed for years: debt, dependence, denial, image management, avoidance. Nobody wanted to examine the foundation. Everybody preferred the view. That's a mistake people make in life all the time. They focus on what looks impressive instead of what actually supports them. The irony is that foundations are usually boring. Discipline is boring. Responsibility is boring. Budgeting is boring. Honest conversations are uncomfortable. Personal accountability isn't glamorous. But those are the things that hold everything together. Not the appearance, the structure. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my family's story, it's this. Don't wait for collapse before paying attention. Look at the cracks. Ask the difficult questions. Face the uncomfortable truths. Because the truth you confront today is almost always cheaper than the truth you postpone until tomorrow. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't fixing a problem. It's admitting one exists. The first time I returned to the Sinclair estate, after everything happened, the place felt different. Not because the building had changed. The walls were still there. The ocean was still there. The same long driveway still curved toward the front entrance. What changed was the illusion. Once the truth is exposed, it's difficult to pretend you never saw it. And that's where I want to leave this story. Not with the deed, not with the argument, not with my father's reaction, but with the lesson that mattered most. A lot of people have asked me the same question. Why didn't you throw them out? Legally, I could have. The property belonged to me. The documents were clear. Nobody would have stopped me. After years of being treated like the family disappointment, after years of hearing that I would never survive on my own, after years of watching my brother waste opportunities other people would have treasured, I certainly had enough reasons. But reasons and wisdom are not always the same thing. Here's what I've learned. Revenge feels powerful when you're imagining it. Reality is usually different. Most people think strength means winning. I don't. I think strength means remaining in control of yourself after you've already won. Anyone can act out of anger. Anyone can lash out when they're hurt. Anyone can use power to settle scores. The real challenge comes when you finally have the ability to hurt someone and choose not to. That isn't weakness. That's discipline. And discipline has carried me further than anger ever could. Throughout my career, I've worked with people from every background imaginable. I've met generals and mechanics, pilots and welders, engineers and electricians. I've spent time with people who earned six figures and people who earned much less. You know what I've noticed? The most respected people are rarely the most impressive-looking people. They're the most dependable people. When things go wrong, everyone looks for the same person. The one who stays calm, the one who takes responsibility, the one who solves problems instead of creating new ones. That's real influence. Not titles, not money, not social status, dependability. The world talks a lot about success. Not enough people talk about usefulness. Those aren't always the same thing. My father spent decades building an image of success. The estate, the business reputation, the appearance of control. But when the real storm arrived, none of those things saved him. The thing that saved the family wasn't image. It was a decision made quietly 6 years earlier by the person he considered a burden. That's why I tell people to invest in skills instead of appearances. Skills stay with you. Appearances come and go. A luxury car can disappear. A title can disappear. A business can fail. A market can crash. A reputation can change overnight. But competence follows you everywhere. Nobody can repossess your ability to solve problems. Nobody can foreclose on your character. Nobody can take away the lessons you've earned through experience. That's why I chose the life I chose. Not because it was easy, because it was real. Another lesson I'd like to leave with you is this. Build your reputation on what you actually do, not on what you want people to think you do. We're living in a time when many people spend more energy managing impressions than building substance. It's understandable. The rewards can seem immediate. Attention, validation, recognition. But foundations don't care about attention. Foundations care about strength. And life eventually tests all of us. Sometimes the test is financial. Sometimes it's professional. Sometimes it's health. Sometimes it's loss. Sometimes it's betrayal. The details change. The principle doesn't. When the pressure arrives, the only thing that matters is what was built underneath the surface. That's true for buildings. It's true for careers. And it's true for people. If you're listening to this story today and you're going through a difficult season, I want you to remember something. Progress isn't always visible. Some of the most important work happens where nobody can see it. The discipline you're building, the skills you're developing, the habits you're creating, the responsibilities you're carrying, those things matter. Even when nobody applauds them, even when nobody notices, even when people underestimate you, especially then. Because one day, the people who judged you by appearances may discover they completely misunderstood who was holding everything together. That happened in my family. Maybe it will happen in yours. Maybe it will happen in your workplace. Maybe it will happen somewhere else entirely. But whether it happens or not, the lesson remains the same. Be the person who strengthens the foundation, not the person who only decorates the front porch. As for me, I never needed my father to admit I was right. I never needed my brother to apologize, and I never needed anyone's permission to move forward. The freedom came from understanding my own value long before they did. Thank you for spending this time with me and following this story all the way to the end. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone in your life, or if it helped you see your own situation differently, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We share new stories every day at 8:30 a.m. ET and 1:30 p.m. ET. Make us part of your daily routine, and I'll see you in the next story.